June 18, 1944. 3:12 a.m. northern coast of New Guinea. The jungle did not sleep. It breathed. It exhaled damp heat and the slow rot of vegetation that had been dying for centuries. Corporal Danny Meyers lay face down in mud that smelled of iron and mildew, listening to the rhythm of Japanese voices drifting from a bamboo barracks 30 yards ahead. The camp lanterns flickered through palm fronds like distant stars seen underwater. Meyers did not move. He had been still for 27 minutes. Long enough for ants to crawl over his neck. Long enough for the mud to cool against his cheek. Long enough for doubt to try to speak. He silenced it. Meyers was 22 years old, from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Son of a railroad mechanic and a church pianist. Before the war, he had never been farther than Memphis. Now he was crouched outside a fortified Imperial Japanese supply camp carved into the jungle canopy, carrying nothing but a suppressed pistol, a field knife, and a folded oilskin packet sewn into the lining of his trousers. That packet was empty when he crossed the perimeter wire 2 hours earlier. It would not be empty when he left. The mission had not been dramatic when it was issued. No speeches, no flags, a map pinned against a crate. Intelligence suggested that this particular camp housed a temporary communications relay coordinating Japanese coastal convoys. Intercepted fragments mentioned fuel movements, possibly troop transfers, possibly something larger. Division command wanted confirmation, convoy schedules, code fragments, call signs, anything that would let Allied naval forces intercept before the ships dispersed into the Pacific. The problem was distance. The problem was terrain. The problem was that no aerial reconnaissance could penetrate the jungle canopy thick enough to hide a cathedral. So they sent Meyers. He had been a farm boy before he became a Marine scout. Good at moving quietly. Good at reading terrain. Good at noticing what did not belong. His platoon commander once said he could smell a tripwire before he saw it. Meyers never corrected him. It didn't smell. It was a pattern. The jungle had patterns. And anything that disrupted them was human. He had crawled through drainage ditches to avoid the outer sentries. Waited until a guard paused to light a cigarette before sliding beneath the wire. The rain earlier that evening had softened the ground, masking his movement. Now he lay within reach of the command hut, distinguished not by size but by order. The lantern inside burned steadier. The voices were calmer. Paper rustled. He counted 5 men inside. 1 officer. 4 enlisted. 1 radio set positioned near the wall. Morse bursts intermittently. Not constant. That meant message preparation rather than transmission. Preparation meant documents. At 3:18, a sentry walked past the hut and paused to relieve himself against a tree. The officer inside laughed at something in a low voice. Meyers moved. He crossed the final 10 yards in a crouch, knife drawn. The sentry never turned. The body lowered without a sound. Meyers eased the hut flap aside and stepped through the shadow like he belonged to it. The officer reached for his sidearm. The suppressed pistol coughed twice. 1 enlisted man lunged. The knife ended that motion. The others froze, stunned by the intimacy of violence in such a confined space. Meyers did not hesitate. 3 more shots. Silence returned to the hut except for the small ticking of the radio. He did not search drawers randomly. He went straight to the table beside the map rack. He knew how field officers organized temporary command posts. Schedules closest to reach. Cipher sheets folded twice. Convoy codes clipped beneath a weighted compass. He found them within 30 seconds. Oilskin packet opened. Papers folded. Inserted. Closed. He turned to leave, and then the flare went up outside. Someone had found the sentry. The jungle ignited in white light for 3 heartbeats. Shadows inverted. Meyers dove through the hut's rear panel as rifle fire shredded bamboo walls. The flare descended hissing into the mud. Shouts erupted in Japanese. More flares launched. The night lost its secrecy. Meyers ran. He did not run blindly. He ran diagonally through the drainage ditch he had used before. Bullets snapped through palm trunks behind him. A machine gun opened from the camp's eastern edge. He felt heat along his left arm and realized, dimly, that something had torn flesh. He kept moving. The problem with jungle escape was not speed. It was visibility. Every branch could hook cloth. Every root could twist an ankle. Meyers slid into a low ravine and pressed himself against clay. Footsteps thundered above. A dog barked. He checked the oilskin packet. Still there. Still dry. He knew what it meant. Convoy schedules meant interception windows. Interception windows meant fuel destroyed at sea rather than artillery shells landing on American infantry weeks later. It meant fewer Marines dying on beaches they had not yet seen. It meant timing. He waited 6 minutes in the ravine while patrols fanned outward. Then he began moving again, slower now, angling toward the extraction point near the mangrove inlet where a 2-man canoe team waited in darkness. By the time he reached the shoreline, dawn had begun to stain the horizon. He was shaking, not from fear but from blood loss. The tear in his left forearm had deepened. A round had grazed him, splitting muscle and skin. He could see bone white through red. The canoe team pulled him aboard without words. As they paddled into open water, Meyers pressed his hand against the oilskin packet sewn into his trousers. It was intact. The documents would reach battalion command within the hour. They would reach fleet command within the day. But at that moment, drifting across a flat Pacific surface painted gold by the rising sun, Meyers realized something else. If he were captured before those papers were decoded and acted upon, if Japanese patrol boats intercepted them, if a search party traced blood back to shoreline, if by some turn of fate he fell into enemy hands, the packet sewn into his uniform would become evidence. Evidence that could unravel operations far larger than himself. He stared at his torn arm. The wound burned, and somewhere in that heat, a calculation began forming. He had protected the intel once. He might have to protect it again. The canoe did not make it far before the engine noise came. It began as a vibration beneath the surface, felt rather than heard. The paddler froze first. Meyers turned his head toward open water just as a low silhouette cut across the horizon. A Japanese patrol launch, sweeping the inlet in a slow arc. They had anticipated exfiltration, or they had simply widened the net. It did not matter which. What mattered was distance. The canoe had none. The mangroves that had hidden them were now behind. Ahead, the water opened into a channel too shallow for deep-draft ships but perfect for patrol craft. The engine tone shifted, closer now. A searchlight snapped on and skimmed the water in a wide, deliberate sweep. The paddler whispered one word, "Down." They angled toward a mudflat barely covered by 2 feet of brackish water. The canoe slid into reeds. Meyers eased himself over the side, suppressing a groan as his injured arm dragged against wood. The salt hit exposed muscle like acid. He did not react. Could not. The patrol launch slowed. The searchlight paused. For a long second it hovered over the reeds, illuminating dragonflies and suspended mist. Then it moved on. But the engine did not. It idled. They were not convinced. Meyers' breathing shortened, not from panic but from blood loss. The water around him darkened in thin ribbons. He pressed his elbow against his ribs, trying to slow it. The oilskin packet pressed against his thigh, a physical reminder of why this moment mattered. The patrol boat cut its engine entirely. Silence, except for insects. That was worse. 2 Japanese soldiers stepped off the launch into knee-deep water. Rifles slung high. One carried a bayonet fixed. They began walking toward the reeds in a slow, methodical line. Search. Recover. Interrogate. If captured alive, Meyers would be searched. Stripped. The packet would be found. Cipher sheets. Convoy timetables. Frequency logs. It would not just compromise a raid, it would compromise entire naval movements. The kind that shaped campaigns. The paddler's eyes met Meyers. There was no plan left. Only proximity. 10 yards. 8. 6. The Japanese soldiers prodded reeds with rifle barrels. One of them stopped and crouched, examining something in the mud. Blood. The soldier turned his head slowly toward Meyers' position. There are moments in war when fear spikes and vanishes. This was not one of them. It was cold, measured, almost detached. Meyers knew what interrogation meant in the Pacific theater. He had seen what remained of prisoners taken during earlier operations. He had heard stories from Guadalcanal. There would be no delay long enough for Fleet Command to act. No window for encryption teams to exploit the data. Capture meant erasure of advantage. He shifted slightly, feeling the packet against his thigh seam. He made the decision. It was not heroic. It was mechanical. He reached into his webgear and withdrew his small lighter, a Zippo his father had mailed him from Arkansas the year before. The engraving had faded from constant handling, but the hinge still snapped clean. The Japanese soldier stepped closer, lifting reeds. Meyers slid the oilskin packet free inside the water, keeping it below the surface. The documents were dry within, but the outer cloth was now soaked. He struck the lighter beneath the surface's edge, shielding flame with his body. The lighter caught. He pressed it against his own torn forearm. There is no clean way to describe what happens when flame meets exposed muscle. The smell comes first, then the sound, an almost inaudible hiss. The pain follows a fraction of a second later, total and absolute. Meyers did not scream. He bit down on mud. The flesh blackened instantly where he held the flame. Smoke drifted across the reeds. The Japanese soldier smelled it. He straightened sharply and pivoted toward the source. In that same instant, Meyers shoved the oilskin packet into the cauterized wound cavity, into the raw split muscle itself, and pressed his burned forearm tight against his chest. The flame died. The smell intensified. The soldier stepped forward, rifle raised. He saw only a wounded American half-submerged in swamp water, clutching his arm, barely conscious. The packet was gone from sight. The soldier barked a command. The second man joined him. They dragged Meyers from the reeds. The paddler never moved. He sank lower into mud and remained unseen. They searched Meyers. Pockets, webgear, boots. They found nothing. The officer on the patrol launch shouted a question. The soldier responded, shaking his head. No documents. No visible satchel. Just a bleeding Marine who would not last long. One soldier raised his rifle. The officer called him off. Dead men did not provide information. Live ones might. They hauled Meyers aboard the patrol launch and bound his wrists. His burned arm throbbed with a rhythm that eclipsed thought. The smell of charred flesh mixed with diesel and sea air. He felt consciousness slipping in pulses. He had not destroyed the intel. He had hidden it. Inside himself. If he survived long enough to escape or long enough to be recovered, the packet would still exist. If he did not, it would die with him. The patrol launch turned east toward the camp. The sun rose fully over the Pacific, illuminating the jungle canopy where hours earlier Meyers had moved like shadow. Smoke from the command hut still drifted faintly. The convoy schedules were now sealed inside a wound no enemy would willingly examine. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, American destroyers waited without knowing that the timing of their next engagement now depended on whether one corporal from Arkansas could survive what he had just done. They did not take him back to the command hut, that had already burned to a skeleton of charred timber and sagging tin by the time the patrol launch returned. Instead, they hauled him to a smaller structure near the shoreline, a processing shack, used for temporary holding and interrogation before transport inland. It smelled of mildew, engine oil, and old rope, the kind of place meant to break momentum. Not bodies yet, just resolve. They threw him onto the plank floor. His hands were tied behind him with a coarse cord that cut into his wrists. His burned arm was no longer bleeding heavily. The cauterization had worked, but the damage was severe. The skin had fused in patches. Beneath it, the oilskin packet sat wedged against muscle and bone, wrapped tight by swelling flesh. Every heartbeat pushed it deeper. A Japanese non-commissioned officer crouched beside him and lifted his chin with 2 fingers. He studied Meyers' face carefully, as if cataloging details for later. He spoke in slow, deliberate Japanese, then repeated something in broken English. "You radio man?" Meyers did not answer. The officer's expression did not change. He stood and motioned toward the arm. 2 soldiers pinned Meyers' shoulders. Another began cutting away the sleeve of his uniform jacket. The cloth peeled back. The smell intensified immediately. Even the soldiers flinched. The burn was severe, blackened tissue where flame had kissed open flesh. The officer leaned closer, eyes narrowing. He reached out and prodded the wound lightly with the tip of a wooden chopstick. Meyers' vision went white. He bit down so hard on his own tongue he tasted blood. The officer withdrew the stick and examined it. Nothing. He spoke quietly to the others. A brief exchange. The tone shifted from suspicion to irritation. They had seen burns before, grenades, artillery, fuel fires. They had seen soldiers panic and destroy documents in flames. But what lay in front of them was not a document burn. It was a desperate field cauterization. They misread it. They believed he had simply tried to stop the bleeding. The officer stood. "Doctor," he said, "not for mercy, for utility." A medic was summoned from another hut, a young man with wire spectacles and steady hands. He knelt and inspected the damage more clinically. He cleaned around the edges with alcohol. The liquid hit charred tissue like acid. Meyers did not scream. The medic spoke quietly to the officer. The translation was unnecessary. The arm was salvageable if treated. The prisoner could survive, which meant he could be questioned properly. They bandaged the wound loosely and left him on the floor while arrangements were made to transport him inland to a larger facility, one better suited for extended interrogation. Time. Every minute he remained alive was time bought for the fleet. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the day lengthened. Heat pressed through the wooden slats. Insects moved lazily across the floor. Outside, engines came and went. The war continued, indifferent to his body. In those drifting hours, memory intruded. Arkansas fields at dusk. His father leaning against a fence post, talking about duty as if it were not something men wore on uniforms but something quieter. Something lived in decisions no one witnessed. He wondered vaguely whether anyone would ever know what he had done. The packet inside his arm throbbed like a second pulse. Late afternoon brought movement again. They dragged him upright and half-carried him to a truck waiting beyond the hut. His legs barely obeyed. The medic had wrapped the burn well enough to stop infection for now. But the swelling was worse. The packet pressed against nerve endings with every jolt. The truck rolled inland along a narrow jungle road. And then something happened that neither side had planned. The sky changed. At first it was only a distant rumble, low and indistinct. The Japanese soldiers glanced upward reflexively. Aircraft noise was not uncommon, but this tone was heavier, deeper. Meyers heard it too. He did not need to see the silhouettes to recognize the engine rhythm. Twin engines. Radial. American. The first bomb fell half a mile west of the road. The explosion rippled through the jungle canopy like thunder trapped under leaves. Birds erupted skyward. The truck driver swerved instinctively. The second bomb landed closer. Dirt and debris showered the road. The officer shouted orders. The truck accelerated, then braked hard as another explosion tore into the tree line ahead. The convoy schedules. The radio frequencies. The timing. American bombers were striking supply depots near the coast. Right on schedule. Right on the timeline hidden inside his arm. The Japanese driver panicked. He turned the truck off the road into a shallow ditch to avoid debris. The vehicle lurched violently and stalled. The soldiers jumped out, scanning the sky. Another wave roared overhead. Meyers felt the shift in gravity before he understood it. The soldiers had momentarily forgotten him. He rolled off the back of the truck and hit the ground hard. Pain detonated up his spine. He crawled. Not toward the jungle. Toward the ditch. The earth there was soft from recent rain. He pressed his body flat against mud and held still. The bombing continued for nearly 3 minutes. Not random. Targeted. Coastal installations. Fuel dumps. A communications relay near the shoreline. The truck soldiers scrambled to regroup, shouting conflicting orders. The officer attempted to rally them. And in that chaos, one soldier noticed the empty truck bed. He shouted. 2 soldiers sprinted toward the ditch. Meyers did not try to run. He could not. Instead, he rolled onto his back and reached for the sidearm one soldier had left tucked into the truck's front seat. A small oversight made during panic. He fired once. The recoil jarred through his injured arm like lightning. The soldier fell. The second raised his rifle. The shot missed wide as the jungle shook again from another distant detonation. The moment fractured into noise and smoke. And in that fractured space, half bomb blast, half instinct, Corporal Danny Meyers forced himself upright on legs that barely held weight and disappeared into jungle brush as if swallowed. Behind him, Japanese soldiers fired blindly into foliage. Ahead of him lay miles of dense green and a coastline being systematically dismantled by American bombers. Inside his arm, the packet remained intact. If he could survive long enough to reach friendly lines, or even just transmit its existence, the strike pattern unfolding across the coast would only be the beginning. The bombing continued long after the truck engine fell silent. And somewhere above the canopy, American pilots had no idea that the precision of their targets that afternoon depended on a corporal who had chosen flame over capture and flesh over surrender. The jungle did not welcome him. It swallowed him. The canopy closed overhead in layers of green so thick the late afternoon bombing flashes became muted pulses instead of light. The air was heavier here, stagnant and wet, carrying the smell of sap, rot, and disturbed soil. Meyers stumbled through it blindly at first, crashing through brush without grace, without strategy, running on instinct rather than training. Every branch that struck his burned arm felt like a blade. Every misstep threatened to pitch him face-first into mud he might not have the strength to rise from. Behind him, voices spread out like a net. Short commands. Sharp whistles. They were not firing wildly anymore. They were hunting. Japanese jungle units were trained for pursuit. They moved in arcs, not lines. They anticipated panic and flanking. Meyers knew this. He had studied their tactics before volunteering for the patrol that put him here. What he had not studied was how to run from them with half his body numb from shock. He forced himself to slow. Running would get him killed. He dropped into a crouch behind a thick tangle of bamboo and listened. The jungle spoke in layers. Cicadas, distant bomb concussion rolling like far-off thunder. Leaves settling. Beneath that, boots in mud. Not many. 3, maybe 4. They were tracking him directly. He looked down at his own footprints. Clear. Obvious. He changed direction abruptly, stepping into a shallow stream that cut diagonally through the undergrowth. The water reached his knees. The burn screamed as liquid seeped through the bandage. He did not stop. He walked upstream for 20 yards, then doubled back down the opposite bank and climbed into thicker growth. It would not fool professionals for long, but it might slow them. The packet inside his arm shifted with each movement, pressing harder against swelling tissue. He could feel the edges now, sharp through flesh. The burn had sealed the outer wound, but the inflammation was worsening. If infection sets in, the fever would come quickly. And if the fever came before he reached friendly lines, he stopped that thought. Instead, he focused on orientation. When he had first been captured near the coast, he had counted distance during transport by time and engine pattern. Roughly 6 miles inland. The bombing earlier had targeted depots west of his original capture point, which meant American aircraft were hitting coastal infrastructure in a pattern radiating from the naval anchorage he had identified. The intelligence had already begun to work. If he could survive long enough to reach Allied reconnaissance teams operating on the perimeter of the island, if he could confirm secondary targets, they might accelerate the strike window. He moved again, this time deliberately, angling toward higher ground. Jungle pursuit was easier downhill. High ridges forced hunters into narrower approaches. The sun began lowering, though little of it reached the forest floor. The bombing faded into sporadic echoes. Either the wave had completed its run or anti-aircraft batteries had forced them off. He did not know which. What he did know was that his legs were failing. The body has limits. Even adrenaline cannot erase blood loss, trauma, dehydration. He found a fallen tree half swallowed by vines and slid behind it. His chest rose and fell unevenly. His injured arm had begun trembling uncontrollably. He pressed his forehead into cool bark and listened again. Silence. Not safe. Silence. Minutes passed. He risked peeling back part of the bandage. The sight nearly unmade him. The burn was worse than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. Flesh swollen, blackened at the edges, skin split where internal pressure pushed outward. Beneath that, he could see a faint outline, an unnatural firmness where the oilskin packet rested. It had to come out eventually. If he reached friendly forces, a surgeon could cut it free. If he did not, he heard movement again. Closer. One voice this time. Measured. Careful. They were adapting. He did not have ammunition left. The pistol had fired once and jammed when he dropped it during his sprint into brush. His Thompson had been lost at capture. What remained was a combat knife strapped to his boot. And he let the approaching soldier pass his position. The Japanese infantryman moved with precision, rifle raised, scanning foliage methodically. He paused twice, crouching to inspect ground signs. He was good. Meyers waited until the soldier's back faced him. Then he moved. It was not a cinematic charge. It was desperate and silent and close. He covered the short distance in 3 strides and drove the knife upward under the ribcage before the man could turn. The struggle was brief, violent, intimate. The rifle discharged once into the canopy as they fell together. Then stillness returned. Meyers lay there a long moment, breathing against the dead soldier's shoulder. He did not look at the face. He retrieved the rifle. 3 rounds in the chamber. 1 spare clip. He left the body where it fell and moved again. Dusk settled fully. The jungle changed tone when darkness came. Sounds sharpened. Insects grew louder. Human movement became riskier. He climbed. Upward. Toward a low ridge that overlooked a narrow clearing carved by artillery months earlier. From that height, he could see something faint through trees, smoke columns. Not from bombing. From signal flares. Red. Green. Allied reconnaissance signals. He nearly collapsed from relief. It was not a base. Not a camp. But it was proof of presence. American or British forward observers were operating somewhere beyond that clearing. He began descending the far side of the ridge. And then the fever hit. It did not arrive gradually. It struck. A wave of heat from inside, as if the burn had ignited again beneath the bandage. His vision narrowed. The jungle tilted. He staggered, fell, forced himself up. Every step now felt disconnected from conscious thought. He moved because stopping meant death, not only his own but the intelligence's. Halfway down the slope, he lost footing entirely and slid into the clearing below. Rifle flying from his hands. Body twisting. He hit hard. And voices surrounded him instantly. English. Accent English. Hold it. Who the hell? Boots rushed in. Rifles trained. A flashlight beam cut across his face. An American corporal knelt and rolled him onto his back. Recognition flickered in the man's expression as he saw the torn uniform, the burn, the patch marking intelligence corps. Jesus Christ. Get the medic. Meyers tried to speak. Only one word came. Packet. They did not understand. He tried again, forcing clarity through fever. My arm. The medic cut the bandage away under lantern light. And for the second time that day, men stared at the wound in silence. The surgeon assigned to the forward unit made the decision quickly. No morphine. They needed to remove it now. Under a tarp stretched between trees, with artillery rumbling in the distance and night insects screaming in chorus, they cut into burned flesh and extracted the oilskin packet still intact, still dry, still legible. Inside were coordinates, fuel depot clusters, transport schedules, frequency windows, and confirmation of the fleet's staggered anchorage positions. The American corporal who had first found him read the top sheet under dim light and understood immediately. This changes everything. Above the canopy, far beyond the ridge, Allied bombers were already turning for base. But within hours, naval artillery would adjust range. Carrier groups would shift strike timing. And what had begun as a single patrol behind enemy lines would ripple outward across the Pacific theater. Meyers never saw the second wave. He drifted under surgical shock before dawn. But in the days that followed, as coordinated strikes dismantled supply nodes and disrupted Imperial naval movement across that sector, officers would note in their logs that the timing had been unusually precise. They would never write the full story. only that the information had arrived in time. He woke to canvas. Not the jungle canopy canvas. Brown, stiff, smelling faintly of antiseptic and damp earth. It fluttered slightly with night wind pushing through the seams of the field hospital tent. For several seconds, Corporal Danny Meyers did not know where he was. The fever had stripped context from his memory. There was only pain and the rhythmic hum of distant aircraft engines. Then he remembered the clearing, the lantern, the knife, the packet. He tried to move his left arm and felt only a heavy pull of bandaging and splinting. The limb was wrapped from shoulder to wrist in layered gauze. A wooden brace held it immobilized against his chest. Beneath that he could feel absence. Not amputation, but something removed. Hollow. A nurse leaned into his field of vision. Not Japanese. American. Easy, she said quietly. You're not dying. He did not ask if that was certain. He swallowed, throat dry as ash. The packet. She glanced over her shoulder toward the far end of the tent, where a lantern burned brighter over a table cluttered with maps. It got where it needed to go. That was enough. He closed his eyes. Outside the tent, artillery rolled in a measured cadence. Not frantic now, but deliberate, organized, timed. Each blast carried intention rather than desperation. Naval guns, likely, coordinated with air. The machine had shifted, and he had felt its pivot. Over the next 3 days, the fever came in waves. Infection threatened to take the arm twice. Sulfa powder packed into tissue. Bandages changed. Fluids forced into him in tin cups. He drifted in and out of consciousness to the soundtrack of war being dismantled in pieces beyond the jungle perimeter. On the second night, someone read aloud in low tones from a field dispatch. Secondary fuel depots confirmed destroyed. Naval transport vessel struck during repositioning attempt. Anti-aircraft frequency window exploited. He did not open his eyes. He did not need to. He knew what those words meant. The depot he had identified was not merely storage, it was staging. Fuel meant mobility. Mobility meant counterstrike capacity. Remove it, and a fleet becomes an anchor without water. The coordinates he carried had exposed that vulnerability. But what would not appear in the dispatches, what would never be logged in official after-action reports, was the moment under the lantern when burned flesh parted to reveal oilskin intact. No citation would mention that. No speech would. On the fourth morning, an officer entered the tent. Major Insignia, Intelligence Branch. He stood at the foot of Meyers' cot for several seconds before speaking. You understand what you did. It was not a question. Meyers looked at him, eyes clearer now despite exhaustion. I understood what I had. The major nodded once. You cost them 3 resupply convoys and forced a naval withdrawal they won't recover from before the next phase. That information shifted timelines by weeks. Weeks. In the Pacific, weeks were everything. Weeks determined which islands held and which fell, which garrisons starved and which reinforced, which carrier groups risked exposure and which waited. Weeks determined how many names would be carved into white crosses on Pacific beaches. The major cleared his throat. There will be paperwork. A recommendation. Meyers' expression did not change. With respect, sir. I didn't do it for paper. The officer studied him carefully, then gave a short nod. I know. He turned to leave, paused. They're calling it a breakthrough in coordinated strike intelligence. Meyers managed a faint, humorless breath. It was just a map. The major left, and the tent returned to quiet. Weeks later, as his arm healed into a rigid, scar-bound memory of flame, Meyers would be evacuated to a larger facility. Surgeons would inform him that full mobility would never return. The burn had destroyed muscle tissue too deeply. Nerve damage was permanent. He would never hold a rifle properly again. He would never climb jungle terrain under full load. But by then, the campaign had already moved forward. The island where he had been captured fell before autumn. Naval resistance in that sector fractured. Strategic momentum shifted toward the larger objective, cutting Imperial supply lines until their reach exceeded their capacity to sustain. Years later, historians would describe the phase as a natural turning point, Inevitable once American industrial output reached critical mass. They would cite tonnage, carrier counts, fuel production ratios. They would not cite a corporal from Arkansas pressing a blade into his own flesh beneath a broken crate. Because wars are often remembered in abstractions. Production numbers, fleet movements, command decisions. But somewhere in the chain between reconnaissance and execution lies a human decision made in isolation, without guarantee, without witness. In a small farmhouse outside Little Rock, decades after the war, a wooden box would sit in a closet beside winter coats. Inside it, wrapped carefully in oilskin of his own making, would be the original burn bandage the field surgeon allowed him to keep. Not the packet. The packet belonged to archives. The bandage belonged to memory. His children would never fully understand why he kept it. They would know only that their father avoided fire pits at family gatherings, that he turned his body slightly when someone stood on his left side. That once, when asked about the war, he said simply, "Some information costs." And that was all. But in a different archive, in a classified intelligence report later declassified and folded quietly into broader campaign analysis, there would be a brief line buried beneath logistical summaries. Source material obtained under extreme personal risk. Transmission altered strike sequence to decisive effect. It would not mention his name, but it would describe the impact. And somewhere in that phrasing, extreme personal risk, was the truest epitaph available to men like him. Not heroic, not cinematic, just